I am Bill Bratton. I'm the Police Commissioner for the City of New York. The Crime Bill of 1994, the Omnibus Crime Bill, or the Community Policing Bill as it's more commonly called, I think has a mixed record of success. I think clearly the hiring of the 100,000 additional officers was significantly impactful on the subsequent significant reductions in crime nationally, almost 30% reduction in violent crime nationally. And that reversed a crime increase trend of the previous 20 to 30 years. And we've seen that crime reduction trend overall hold over the 21st century as we're now 14 years into it. It was mixed in the sense that some of the incarceration issues that we're struggling with today, the significant acceleration of arrests in many jurisdictions resulted in prison overcrowding and also many of the subsequent racial tensions that we're now experiencing around the issue of incarceration practices. The New York experience, I would point out, is different than most of the country, and it was consciously felt back in 1994 by myself and others that the crime bill, if successfully implemented, would actually result in fewer people in jail over time. And that, in fact, has occurred here in New York. But because of practices in some other states, California I'm most familiar with, their parole and probation practices, that it did not have a beneficial effect over time as it relates to incarceration. I think the most significant impact of the Omnibus Crime Bill was that it institutionalized the community policing philosophy. Community policing, as I describe it in simplest terms, was the emphasis on partnership between police and community, partnership that would identify the problems or priorities that each neighborhood felt was causing crime or disorder or fear in their particular neighborhood. And thirdly, that it returned police to the focus and the acceptance of responsibility for the prevention of crime. Something that in the 70s and 80s in particular, police had been excused by political leadership, by academics, by many police leaders from having any responsibility for the prevention of crime. The irony being the prevention of crime, going back to Sir Robert Peel's time, that was his first of his 9 principles, that the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. We focused our efforts in the 70s and 80s on responding to crime, 911 systems, better forensics investigation, better education of officers, with the belief that police could not have impact on what were thought to be the causes of crime in the 70s and 80s. And those causes were thought to be poverty, racism, demographics, the weather, all types of issues that society was grappling with. Cause of crime is quite simple. It's much more simple than that. It's people, criminals in some instances, or people in the moment of emotion, passion, under the influence of drugs, whatever. The increase in the number of emotionally disturbed individuals in our country, that they are the cause of crime, and the basic mission of police is to control behavior. And community policing returned police to that responsibility. So the benefit of the crime bill was certainly research. I've already talked about the negative in the sense of the incarceration practices and policies that were embraced by many states and municipalities to get access to funds that are being provided for incarceration initiatives. But I think the biggest benefit of all was it created a generation of police leaders, a generation, I think, of many government officials, and a generation of community leaders who all understood and embraced the importance of that partnership concept, that the old African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, police cannot, on their own, solve any community's problems for the long term. We are an essential element of it, probably the most essential in many instances, but that we've come to recognize that we need to have collaborators, we need to have partners. And policing in the 90s, particularly new police leadership who had received now college educations, oftentimes through federal funding, we're embracing this more progressive view of what policing should be all about. Well, the good news is I think that in American policing, particularly at the major city chiefs level, the Police Executive Research Forum, and that the IACP, which represents the many thousands of police agencies across the country, that we tend to be, and I should also indicate the sheriff's organization, although they tend to be elected officials in addition to being law enforcement. We're much more progressive than I think we were in the 70s or 80s, much better educated, much more willing to embrace the concept of change, much more willing to take leadership in pushing for that change. And so we have a big head start that we did not have as firmly established leadership going into the early 1990s that we now have, and many seasoned veterans of what works and what doesn't work. So that's a good head start. American policing is probably more progressive than where our Congress is and where many of our political leaders are at the moment, which is ironic. Well, the future is always shaped by the past, if otherwise we're doomed to repeat it. And one of the ways to learn from the past is to study it. So research clearly is an area that we need to do a lot more of. The issue in the country also of the incarceration issues. Well, actually, if going back to my point about the 5 or 6 things we need to address, an omnibus crime bill, if you will, should speak to all of those issues. Much the same as the omnibus bill back in the 90s addressed the issue of incarceration concerns then, addressed the issue of whether enough cops, addressed the issue of research, addressed the issues of race, and addressed also for the first time the issue of firearms, that the assault weapons ban, the 10-year ban, and some additional focus on firearms. Those were the issues of the day back then. An omnibus crime bill today would have to focus on those 5 issues as well as others that are currently the crises in American policing and the American criminal justice system of the moment.